Greetings, Dr. Mark Winton here from the University of Central Florida, Department of Criminal Justice, to talk a little bit about theories applied to hate crimes. And this is from a PowerPoint presentation within the hate crimes course. And some of this material will be discussed later on and throughout the semester, and also will be found in your textbook at different points. But I wanted to go ahead and just kind of say a few words about theories. To me, theories are the most important aspect of criminal justice, for the most part, as an academic field. If we don't have theories, what do we have? And then, of course, tying that into the research to support or refute the theories. But there's numerous theories that may be applied to hate crimes. I'm only going to present a few. We could write, volumes of books on theories and hate crimes. And I'm not presenting, the best ones, certainly. I'm just presenting a sample, a biased sample, one I selected, but I tried to vary up the theories so you get a nice representation of what's out there. But there's a lot of sub-theories from the major theories as well. But first I ask you to ask some questions whenever you are reading about a theory in a research article or a theoretical piece, or even when you're talking to someone, whether it happens to be one of your professors, one of your colleagues, or if you're standing in line at the post office and you have your book with you, and all of a sudden the person in front of you decides to strike up a conversation. Strangers usually don't talk to me, so I don't have to worry about that. But you can find out their theories, and you can find out the assumptions of their theories. So we always want to ask, what are the assumptions of the theory? And also, what research has been carried out to support the theory? And what are the weaknesses, as well as the strengths of the theory? What you'll find is often one theory's strength is another theory's weakness, and vice versa. And when we look at the research that is used to support a theory, we might ask, where does that come from? Is that from surveys, from analysis of historical documents or government records? Is it based on comparative case studies or intense observations? Or is it based on legends and myths? You'll find that a lot of people have their own theories, and their support comes from what their friends or family told them, or what they heard on a particular news show, or may coincide with their biases and prejudices, and that kind of gets into the mythical aspects. The first theory I have on the PowerPoint presentation is the medical model, which is actually multiple theories. And some of you may say, how in the world could the medical model apply to hate? And I would say, well, that's something for you to think about further, but I'll give you a couple of ideas how there may be indirect links. For example, we may ask, are there genetic factors for certain mental disorders like antisocial personality disorder, which may make it more likely that someone with prejudices and biases toward others and hatred would actually act out in a violent criminal way? Are there neurotransmitter imbalances in the brain, a chemical imbalance, if you will? Are there brain structure aspects that may increase the risk of engaging in hate or hate crime? And do certain stressors increase the predisposition to act violently? And so, a lot of people say, well, is that medical, or is that situational, or is it based on a combination of factors? And so there certainly may be situations where stressors increase that predisposition to act out violently, and people may act out violently toward particular groups that they may perceive, whether accurate or not, as being threatening to them, or they may be attacking a group for a particular reason related to stressors and strains and what's going on in their brain. Others have talked about hormones and a combination of medical factors coming together. Of course, you can think about the big problems in trying to use a medical model to explain hate crimes. One, of course, would be the attempt by defense attorneys to convince juries that their client engaged in crime because of a medical problem, maybe a chemical imbalance or deficiency, and therefore should not be held accountable because it was beyond their control. And of course, if there was this medical connection, what would we do? Would we try to rebalance the neurotransmitters, and what would we do genetically? So we run into a lot of problems here, and I really haven't seen the medical model used to understand hate crimes. Although, as I mentioned, there may be some indirect links there, but it's something to think about. One thing I will say is that as related to violence, you have this combination of factors. So maybe the medical model might give us more information about those who are more likely to engage in violent behavior. But the medical model doesn't explain why someone would go after one person versus another, or after one particular group and not other groups. So there's certainly some things to take a closer look at there. Then there's the sociobiological or evolutionary, which is the interaction of biological factors and the environment. And certain interactions may increase the likelihood of certain actions. And so what you may have here is some would talk about an evolutionary survival instinct and trying to deal with fears and survival and maybe aspects of biology combining with social interactions and society that people engage in certain behaviors. And so this takes it, I think, a step further beyond the medical model, but still with the same problems that I mentioned. I'll mention the psychoanalytic just because it's so popular in everyday talk, even though people may not even realize they're discussing that. Sorry. But anyway, here we would focus on early childhood traumas and sexual and aggressive impulses, and how components of the personality, which Sigmund Freud identified as the id, the ego, and superego, are out of balance. And also, people using what Freud referred to as defense mechanisms to deal with their anxiety, something like regression or repression or denial or displacement. And to mention Freud's personality parts, the id, ego, and superego, being unbalanced, what I wanted to do is define those briefly. The id consists of the unconscious drives. The superego are the internalized social norms of the culture, and the ego is the mediator between the conflicts of the id and the superego, or between the drives and the demands of society. In other words, the id is that part that wants to do things to satisfy its selfish self and gratify sexual or aggressive impulses. But we wouldn't be able to have a functioning society if people did whatever they wanted to do. So we have the superego, the societal, internalized social norms and culture. And there's conflict between the two. And so the ego kind of mediates through that. Of course, the problem with the psychoanalytic approach is conducting research with those particular terms, id, ego, superego. I mean, how do you define that? How do you see the id? How do you see the ego, the superego? How do we see repression or denial or projection? But there's certainly some interesting concepts. And I would say that there is a good deal of writing on hate crimes related to the psychoanalytic perspective. And so we'll see that come up again. And especially we see people who use Freudian terminology and ideas to look at situations. For example, that some might say that someone sees in a group characteristics of themselves and they go after that group. because they don't like those characteristics, or they feel guilty about their own characteristics, or they have some other situation going on where, to decrease their anxiety, they act out. Whether that is to go with a particular group or a general group, and so a lot of that has to do with what they call the psychodynamics going on with the person. And so again, of course, here, the intervention would be psychoanalysis or counseling or psychotherapy from that particular perspective, where the person would understand where some of those drives come from, those hate drives, and what they could do about that. Social learning and differential association is probably much more popular in criminal justice in explaining hate crimes. And this is that people learn hate from others. They learn the methods and motivations and rationalizations of hating others, individuals and groups, from family and friends and the media. And according to Sutherland and Cressy, criminal behavior is learned through the socialization process, and it's learned through interaction with groups that people are involved with. And as I mentioned, the rationalizations of engaging in criminal activity are learned from others. And so the same principles are in operation here for criminal as well as non-criminal behavior. In essence, just to kind of summarize it, people learn how to hate, and they learn which groups they should hate, and they learn what actions they should take against these groups. The exchange model focuses on rewards and costs, and here we ask, what do hate crime perpetrators have to gain, and what do they have to lose? And so you can kind of do a cost-benefit analysis and see how that materializes. And there's certainly some interest in looking at the exchange perspective, but a lot of theories go beyond that now. Symbolic interactionism focuses on social interaction, the self, role-taking, and meaning of symbols, and also asks the question, how do we label, and how are we labeled in relationship to hatred, belonging to certain groups, having ideas about certain groups, and so on. I will say right now that my own bias is towards symbolic interactionism. That's the theory I use, and later you'll see some of the work that I have done based on symbolic interactionism and hate, as it specifically relates to my specialty area of genocide. And so, but I tell you that I'm not telling you everyone should become a symbolic interactionist. I'm not saying that at all, or that that's the best theory. There's a lot of problems with the theory as well. But it's the theory I use, and I just want to tell you that in advance. So if someone says, well, the professor was a symbolic interactionist, well, yeah, we already know that. Not a problem. So symbolic interactionism focuses on role-taking, the meaning of symbols, and Bloomer, back in his famous 1969 book on symbolic interactionism, made the statement that you'll see in almost every textbook that talks about symbolic interactionism, and that is that people act based on meanings which derive from interaction with others and are interpreted by the individual. So taking this a little bit farther than the social learning theories, we are looking at how people interpret situations and make sense. So there's a lot more going on here, in my opinion, that, of course, we want to take a look at when we begin to identify and try to understand hate crimes. Strain theory is very well known in sociology and criminal justice, and the focus is on a concept Emile Durkheim discussed, anomie. A-N-O-M-I-E, anomie. And that anomie is when social conditions of normlessness, confusion, and ambiguity are present in a society. People don't know really what to do. The rules are unclear. And that social stress generated from anomie increases the likelihood of aggressive behavior. Certainly we've seen where strain seems to occur in some situations, and then we see hate crimes increase. So we'll see that you could take each of these theories and apply it to a specific case and have some good ideas there, for further exploration. And then I give an example of applying strain theory with Linsky, Bachman, and Strauss's state stress index, where they measure economic, family, and community stress at the state level. Conflict theory also is very popular in hate crime research, and here the idea is that hate crimes are related to conflicts and power struggles in communities and society. And this may be related to alienation, where people feel alienated from themselves and others. And so one thing I always found kind of interesting, if you think about the concept of anomie and you think about the concept of alienation, with anomie there is not enough social control. With alienation in the conflict theory, there's too much social control, and that leads to problems. So here you have kind of at the ends of the continuum, whether it's anomie or alienation, you have a situation of misery. The authoritarian personality we'll see discussed later, where someone has this personality style where they dominate subordinates, or they defer to superiors. They also dislike ambiguity. There's also a tendency to dislike and have mistrust of science. They also tend to be concerned about other people's sexuality and project their own issues of insecurities and the like onto others. And this authoritarian personality really is kind of related to the psychoanalytic perspective. And so we'll take a closer look at that authoritarian personality later on in the semester. And also we'll see that there are problems with the authoritarian personality. And one of the big features is often the research and discussion of authoritarian personality focuses on the far right, but we also believe it's very relevant to be focusing on authoritarian personality characteristics on the far left. And so we need to take a closer look at both of those groups. Then there's the power of the situation, the situational aspects. And Milgram's studies regarding shocks are used as an example that of obedience to authority in this situation, where Dr. Milgram told people that didn't appear to have any predisposition to harm others to deliver strong shocks, and many did. Even though in reality the person wasn't getting shocked, but the person doing the shocking thought they were getting shocked, because the so-called victim of the shock would scream out in pain. But people would go ahead and just turn up the voltage and keep shocking. Many would. And so, this is not necessarily aggression, but it's obedience. And so there's some interesting research regarding that particular situation. Also, I'll mention that the participants, especially, you can go on YouTube and watch videos of the actual experiments, and the subjects, the shockers, if you will, did not seem to be gaining pleasure from delivering the shocks. And so many thought that people were just going along with authority figures. Also, Zimbardo's mock prison study found similar results, where he had set up a prison, and he assigned some of his subjects to be prisoners and some as prison guards. Soon the prison guards started abusing the prisoners, and they had to stop the study. Okay, I would also ask, when you think about problems related to these theories, ask, are the interventions or policy recommendations intrusive? Are the concepts of the theory measurable, and does the theory explain the initial motivation to commit the crime? Also, are structural factors analyzed, or large-scale societal factors? And on the other hand, are individual and small group factors analyzed? We might ask, is the theory too narrow or too general? And is power addressed? And are group factors analyzed? So that really is just a brief. Maybe some of you are saying, it wasn't really that brief. But to me, that's just a very brief overview of a few theories. And as we progress in the semester, I'll focus on some theories and have some more videos that will apply a specific theory in much greater detail. But I just wanted us to get started with thinking about those theories and how they may be used, and some of the strengths and some of the weaknesses. So I hope that you will continue to think about theories throughout the semester, and of course throughout your criminal justice related careers. Thank you.